In the previous videos in this series, we have alluded to the circumstances of the fall of Bilazora. In this program, we'll finally answer the question, what happened to Bilazora? We've uncovered artifacts that lead us to believe that the site was inhabited at least by the 6th century BC. When Philip V conquered and fortified Bilazora in 217 BC, Polybius describes it as the largest city in Paeonia. Livy tells us that when Perseus was planning his war against Rome in 169-168 BC, he wanted to send the Gauls to Bylazora. Perseus wouldn't have ordered them to go there if the city was a desolate ruin. Bilazora must still have been a fortified garrison post, and there must have been sufficient provisions to feed the army. It definitely suggests that Bilazora, on the eve of Perseus's defeat, was still a living city. This passage from Livy is the last we hear of Bilazora in the ancient sources.
When Ptolemy wrote his geography, sometime between 130 and 135 AD, he listed the cities of Macedonia and Paeonia. Bilazora was not among them. So Bilazora, once the largest city of Paeonia, according to Polybius, must have been destroyed, abandoned, and forgotten before 135 AD. By the time of Diocletian's Edict of Prices in 301 AD, even the name of Paeonia seems to have fallen out of use. When listing the provinces of the Moesias, the edict lists, among others, Dardania and Macedonia, but not Paeonia. So let's marshal the evidence to see if we can piece together a possible narrative about the fate of Bilazora. As usual, the evidence will come from literary sources and from our archaeological discoveries. We'll turn first to the extant literary evidence.
The defeat of Perseus at the Battle of Pydna in 168 BC did not end Roman hostilities in the Balkans in the Third Macedonian War. The flight and capture of Perseus and the subsequent marauding by the Roman legions are well documented in Livy and Plutarch. The ancient sources all agree the Roman soldiers were brutal. They were ordered to take no prisoners of war, to kill the wounded and to despoil the dead, to accept no surrender of armies during battle, to loot defeated cities, to execute civic leaders who had been pro-Macedonian, and to establish military rule over defeated populations and surrendered cities.
The Romans singled out certain areas of the Balkans for particularly harsh treatment. Cities like Pydna, Melibea, and Pella, the palace at least, were sacked and looted. The victorious Roman commander, Lucius Aemilius Paulus, gave the Roman cavalry permission to ravage the Macedonian countryside as far as the Strumitsa Valley, which is only some 100 kilometers away from Bilazora. The people of Molosia also suffered harshly for their aid to Perseus. Several of their cities were sacked thoroughly, and the populations taken off into slavery. The people of the other cities were ordered to surrender all gold and silver in private hands to the Roman legions. The withdrawal of the Roman legions in 167 BC was what we might call a looting withdrawal through Illyricum. Hard hit were the Penestae. The Penestae were the western neighbors of the Paeonians. There was an explicit understanding between the Senate back in Rome and Aemilius Paulus that the loot from the cities of Macedonia and her allies was to serve as a source of pay for the legions. Polybius, Livy, and Plutarch mention that 70 cities were sacked and their fortifications razed. The thorough pillaging of the Balkans, Macedonia in particular, should not be underestimated.
In the extant descriptions of the aftermath of the Battle of Pydna, Bilazora is not mentioned, nor is Paeonia given much ink. Roman armies passed close by Bilazora on at least 2 occasions, but again, no mention is made of the city. So we have to ask ourselves at this point, what might the Romans have done to a city that, 1, was the largest city of Paeonia, 2, had been fortified since the time of Philip V, 3, had a royal palace garrison post, and 4, was still operational during the Third Macedonian War? We know that the Pella Palace was looted after the Battle of Pydna. The city survived on a reduced scale. The fate of the ancestral palace at Aigai is unclear, although enough evidence points to destruction by fire. There was another royal Macedonian palace garrison utilized by Perseus, that is Demetrius in Greece. Demetrius does not appear to have been destroyed during the actual hostilities of the Third Macedonian War, but Rome would certainly not have left such a site untouched in the aftermath of the war. Diodorus Siculus said that Lucius Aemilius Paulus and his generals did not want to leave Demetrius standing to serve as a future rallying point of the Macedonian opposition to Rome, so he ordered the fortifications to be dismantled. Might this also have been the fate of Bylazora, a similar palace garrison also untouched by the ravages of the war?
This is about as much information as the extant Greek and Latin literary sources can offer with respect to the fate of Bylazora. We will leave these clues temporarily as we examine the archaeological evidence from TFAHR's 6 years of excavations at Bilazura.
The archaeological evidence we have uncovered on the Acropolis is unambiguous. Bilazora met a brutal and violent end. In the Acropolis's last habitational stratum, the signs of a violent demise are ubiquitous. Much of this last habitational stratum showed signs of having been subjected to a great conflagration. In those areas highlighted on the ground plan, we excavated through thick deposits of burned mud brick, ash, and charred timbers. In other areas, pithoi were not just smashed, but pulled up out of the ground and then smashed, as if someone were looking for something hidden. The violent disarray evident in this stratum is testimony that the Bylazora Acropolis was not simply abandoned, it was thoroughly destroyed. That the Bylazora Acropolis came to a cataclysmic end was obvious to us. But even during the first season, there was something about the evidence that troubled us.
The signs of fire and pillage were everywhere, but where was the evidence of an assault on the city? In the first 2 seasons, we had excavated a stretch of about 25 meters of the upper Acropolis wall in Sector 3. But nowhere along those 25 meters did we find a single stone that had fallen from that Acropolis wall. Likewise, in Sector 6, we excavated about an equal length of the Acropolis defensive wall there, and again we found not a stone out of place. Of the great ashlars of the palace of Philip V, not one has yet been found fallen from the walls. We've uncovered a propylon and a stoa. We have their subterranean foundation walls, but not the walls themselves, beyond an occasional single stone or two. Within the rooms of the palace itself, there is an amazing lack of stones fallen from the interior walls. The one exception to this is in the vestibule hall, where a great pile of small stones was thrown up against the northeast corner. So, the evidence from the Acropolis points to this scenario. Bilazora was destroyed by hostile forces who put the Acropolis to the torch, but there are no signs of an assault on the city. Where are the breached walls, the fallen towers, the overturned defensive works? Let's go back to the literary sources.
After the Romans captured Perseus, Macedonian resistance to Rome rapidly evaporated. Macedonian forces were either dead or captured, or they had fled. Since the rather extensive extant literary accounts report no battles around Bylazora for the years 169 to 167 BC, we're probably safe in assuming that any Macedonian troops of Perseus who had been stationed at Bylazora fled upon hearing of Perseus's capture. The civilian population was, in such a scenario, left to fend for itself.
3 courses would have been open to the now undefended populace of the city. 1, they could gather up their valuables and flee, to where might be problematic. 2, they could entrust themselves to the tender mercies of the Roman legions, a dubious proposition at best. 3, they could attempt to resist Rome, an assuredly suicidal alternative. 2 courses were open to the victorious Roman legions when they finally got to Bylazora. 1, they could slaughter the entire population and sack the town. 2, they could loot the town and march the entire population off into slavery. Neither alternative would shock a student of Roman history. But if the population of Bilazora had fled with their valuables, the Roman soldiers would have entered a desolate city. In the 6 years of excavation at Bilazora, we have found only a few human bones from this last stratum of the city, and these meager fragments were found in a burn pile. The evidence thus far does not argue for an assault and an attack followed by a great slaughter. A plausible scenario might well be that the people of this palace and garrison city suspected the grim fate that awaited them at the hands of Rome, and rather than await that gruesome inevitability, they fled. The Romans, then, may have come to a deserted city.
The city may well have been deserted, but it was still significant and still intact. It was the largest population center of Paeonia. It had been fortified. It had a palace garrison post. Like Demetrius in Greece, it conceivably might serve as a future focal point of resistance to Rome. And quite possibly, as in the case of Demetrius, the order might have been given for the destruction of Bylazora's fortifications. If so, then we can be certain the Roman troops would have ransacked the city searching for overlooked valuables. Then they would have torched the city, or at least the Acropolis.
Thus far we have been able to make sense out of two of our archaeological discoveries. One, the widespread conflagration across the Acropolis, often accompanied by an absolute disarray of the artifacts. And two, the paucity of valuables in this last habitation stratum of Bilazora. In the 6 years of TFAHR excavations, we have uncovered only one silver coin and one silver bracelet. The coin was found ground down into the pavement of a gravel street, and the bracelet was found amidst the ashes and charred timbers of the palace's kitchen. If the population of Bilazora fled with their valuables, and if they were followed by Roman soldiers hunting for valuables, who might in turn have been followed finally by scavengers picking through the ruins, it stands to reason that very little would be left for archaeologists 2 millennia later. But this scenario still does not account for all of the evidence. Remember, we still have to account for what we know is missing.
What is it that's missing from the site? Walls. Not just the large stones that may have tumbled from or been hurled from the Acropolis defensive walls, and not just the uppermost courses of the walls. We are in many places missing entire walls. We know of the existence of these missing walls only from the robber trenches left behind when the walls were quarried away. In our first season of excavation, we were baffled by the lack of internal walls in many of the structures we unearthed on the Acropolis. But in the 2009 season, we excavated beneath the last habitation stratum and discovered the existence of the robber trenches. Once we became aware of the existence of these trenches, we were able to quickly spot them. Where stones had been robbed out, soil of a different color and/or texture filled in their space, and you could see the line where the stones of the walls once stood.
We found robber trenches in the casemate wall of Sector 3, the Stoa, and the Palace. The robber trenches are testimony to not just a casual looting of some convenient stones here and there, as happens to most sites over the ages, but to a systematic and thorough quarrying of the site. A thorough demolition of the fortifications, as was ordered for the palace garrison at Demetrius by Aemilius Paulus, may have been what befell Bylazora. In many instances, the walls were quarried away down into their foundations. Such a thorough spoliation would further assure that any hiding places for valuables within the walls themselves would be exposed. This would explain the scarcity of large stones lying about on the Acropolis. The large stones in the Acropolis were quarried away, but several facts still require explanation.
If the city of Bylazora was systematically quarried away, why, we're often asked, are the decorated stones of Philip V's Stoa and Palace facades still there? The thinking is that the stones of the Doric facade of the Stoa and the Corinthian facade of the Palace are some of the finest and best carved stones of Bylazora, so why were they not taken? There's no argument that these sets of stones are the finest we have encountered yet at the site, but both sets of these facade stones were carved for specific buildings with very specific dimensions and proportions. So unless a new building in another city was being constructed with the same exact dimensions and of the same exact architectural style, all these finely cut stones would have been worthless. Moreover, the possibility of damage to things like the arises on the columns or the volutes and acanthus leaves on the capitals would be astronomically high, meaning that more likely than not, these finely cut stones would arrive at their new destination badly damaged.
The men who quarried away Bylazora were surely aware of these considerations. That's why the Doric stones of the Stoa were piled together to be burned down into lime mortar. As we noted in a previous video, all but one of the entablature stones of the Stoa show signs of being chopped up before they were thrown into the pile. The pile, incidentally, where the human bone fragments and some broken pottery were also thrown to be incinerated. The rationale behind the burning is simple. It is easier, because it is lighter, to transport the burned down lime mortar powder to a new site than it is to transport the stones to a new site and burn them down there. It will be only after the full extent of the stoa and the palace vestibule have been excavated that we will be able to estimate how many of the facade stones perished at the hands of the lime burners. For some of the missing stones of the palace facade may well have been burned down along with the stoa stones.
There are some incidental conclusions we can draw about the quarrying away of the stones of the Acropolis of Bilazura. The palace's external walls are most poorly preserved near the Acropolis wall, where we postulated the city gate must have been. The further you get from the gate, the better preserved the walls. This may mean that the demolition proceeded methodically, starting by the gate and proceeding course by course to the parts of the palace furthest away from the gate. We can tell that the stones of the kitchen wall that borders on the internal courtyard were pulled off from the wall by men standing in the internal courtyard. This is the only way to explain how the plaster of that wall remained standing on the inside after the stones had been quarried away.
We offer this scenario of Bilazura's initial abandonment and subsequent destruction, followed by a systematic demolition and quarrying, only as a working hypothesis. Remember, just a minuscule fraction of the site has been excavated. Further excavations in another part of the site may reveal new evidence from which new hypotheses can be formed. We await such revelations from future excavators of Bilazura.